I guess what I would like to talk about today, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Jack, and thank you for listening to me as well. And I want to keep this really informal because I don't have anything kind of big that I want to say at all. But I guess that I am coming from my own kind of personal understanding, if you like. So, what I'm bringing is a very phenomenological kind of understanding of of my own spirituality and how that is kind of why that is kind of involved in ecology. So, about how long ago? It was about 5 years ago when I kind of put together this master's program with some of the forerunners, Jack, Nick, I was involved with when I put it together, and some other people at Lampeter. Why ecology and spirituality felt to me really important to bring together as a very kind of it felt quite radical at the time, to be honest. I think it's become more embedded in how we see the world. It feels like a more natural joining now, but even 5 years ago, it felt like quite a new thing to be putting those two things together in an academic context. So I'd love to kind of just talk you through where I was coming from when I put those two things together, and just my own personal experience of what those two things mean to me, in the hope that that might mean something to you, you know. And so my story really as a phenomenological kind of example of some of the things that you might be dealing with as you go forward. So first of all, to start with this word spirituality. So when I put this together, a lot of people kind of were questioning that word, and it was, you can't use that word, it's the S word, you know, soul, spirituality, sacred, you know, the minute you say those things, it'll be woo-woo, and then you'll be shot down and you can't do that. And I found actually the opposite to be true, that as soon as we started talking about spirituality, then people came forward and said, okay, let's tackle this. We're really interested, particularly with the ecological perspective as well. So my kind of understanding of the word spirituality, as I've kind of tried to brew on that, you know, what do I mean by that when I talk about spirituality, which I quite often do very publicly. For me, it's about a relationship with something bigger than ourselves. It's something that gives us meaning. Jack was talking there about meaning, a way of meaning making in these lives that can give us a sense of belonging. Um, the story of our origins, so that question that we continually ask, I guess, all of our lives, why are we here? You know, why us? What are we doing? You know, what are our gifts? What are our purpose? All those kind of things. That to me is what we mean by spirituality, what it is that we use to give us that sense of meaning. And I think, or certainly speaking from my own perspective anyway, that it often, that search for meaning often comes from this kind of understanding or feeling that something's missing. I in the work that I've done over the years, there's this word that keeps popping up all over the place. Actually, I hear different people using it. I don't know if it's a word of the moment, perhaps it's the past moment, but it's a Welsh word, and I'm sure a lot of you will have come across it. This word, high wreath. Has anybody heard of that word before? Yeah, it was very around about the time we were putting together the ecology and spirituality. It was this word that was talked about a lot, which is this kind of longing, this deep soul longing that we have for something that could be home. And thought about that a lot, because it seems to be something that so many of us are kind of holding, this deep longing for belonging, for home, for something that perhaps we've become separated from, for something that we're trying to recover, but we can't quite say what it is or why it is that we're feeling it. So for me, my longing, my sense of Haraeth is to do with nature. It's to do with my relationship with the natural world. It is my longing to somehow be in deeper conversation with the natural world, which you could extend to the whole world, given that we are nature. Nature is all around. Everything that is made came through nature originally. So it's this how to be in conversation with nature again, which I feel, that has kind of been something that's driven me. It's why I am an ecologist. So I trained in biology, ecology, and I just wanted to look, and I'm sure you probably have, or you will do, look at the meaning of ecology as being this kind of study of the relationships between living organisms, including humans and their physical environment. That's one of the standard definitions that you'll find if you look up ecology, the study of the relationships between living organisms, including humans and their physical environment. But if you look back to the kind of Greek meaning of it, it comes from two words. One is oikos and one is logos. Oikos means house or home, and logos means the study of. So really the kind of etymology of the word ecology is really the study of our home. And going back to this Haraeth word, somehow looking for home. So for me, this idea of ecology kind of has spirituality embedded within it somewhere, if only we can find it. So by putting those two things together, for me, we're looking for something that's bigger than both of them, that's inherent in the both of them. So I'll give you a kind of potted history of kind of what made me interested in this. So I was lucky enough to be brought up in an exceptionally beautiful part of the world, which is the English Lake District, where all the many of the romantic poets kind of lived too. And every Sunday, I was kind of dragged up mountains and around lakes by my parents, and I hated it at the time. And how you always hate things that you're forced to do. But when I was about, I would say probably about 9, I found myself on my own. I don't quite know how it happened. I found myself on my own on the side of a mountain after a long walk on a beautiful summer's day, and just looking up at the mountain, I was suddenly absolutely convinced in every single cell of my body that that mountain, in fact, it makes me feel emotional just to talk about it, that mountain was trying to communicate with me. I felt as though kind of it was trying to speak to me, but I didn't, through my body somehow, and I didn't know how to speak back. I didn't have the ability to understand what it was trying to communicate, or even to say, I don't understand, but I just knew for sure that there was some communication going on. I've since realized about 50 years later that this mountain has had incredible significance in my life, although I haven't really ever put the pieces together until fairly recently. In that I've realized, I don't know why I didn't realize this earlier, but it's the mountain that I can see from my childhood bedroom window. I could actually see it out of my window. I didn't realize it was the same mountain. It's the mountain that is above the retreat centre that I now run up in the Lake District. It's the mountain that if I walk on it, I just get these massive flushes of energy, and kind of feelings of excitement and belonging. And I can't really explain why. But it feels as though this mountain has just been present my whole life, and I haven't really fully been conscious of that. And I suspect that there are many of us that have these kind of experiences, whether we're conscious of it or not, in childhood or perhaps later in life, perhaps in moments of vulnerability or perhaps in dreams, somehow when there are thin times, when the veils are thin, however you want to kind of express it, these experiences happen and either we kind of puzzle over them or we, get rid of them thinking that was just our imagination. But quite often I feel it's these experiences that set up our quest in our life. I'm There is a tribe in North America that are very kind of very well known. I can't remember which tribe it is actually. They're very well known for their dreaming. They're a kind of a tradition based on dreaming. And they say that there is an experience or a dream that we all have as children that sets up our whole life. Our whole life is somehow kind of an extension of kind of answering that call, that dream, that quest, that golden thread that comes through our lives. And actually, you know, in those kind of traditions, and I imagine some of our ancestral traditions, those dreams and experiences would have been caught, and we would have, by elders and people around us, and we would have been held in kind of finding out what those meant. But it's a much more hit or miss thing, I think, in kind of our cultures these days. But for me, it was that experience of the mountain speaking that set up this interest for me in what is our deep relationship with the natural world. So that took me into I have no idea why, but I ended up being a scientist. Well, yes, I do know why. I was interested in nature. I wanted to know how nature worked. I wanted to get them to the mystery, that I'd experienced. So I became a scientist. I studied biology. I then went on to study ecology. I then became involved in environmental protection. So I worked at a fairly senior level at the Environment Agency as their science planner, their climate change policy advisor. I was the scientific consultant to the chief scientist at DEFRA for a while. So, fairly high level kind of environmental science type work. And what I found was that it was very, very reductive. Environmental science, certainly in my experience of it, was very much about taking everything apart and looking at the small pieces and measuring them and then trying to stitch them back together into, okay, what are we going to do about this? So take everything apart, look down the microscope, then times it by 100 in order to get it back up to the real, it's numbers that are then kind of, then you guess to try and make it back into kind of reality. And for me, it felt as though the meaning and the soul and the mystery of the natural world that I was trying to understand was not present in this at all. It felt like the meaning of the things was somehow being lost in the kind of reductionist paradigm that these things are based on. And that we all have different ways of seeing, and that is just that was my take on it. For me, there was not enough soul, mystery, meaning behind that kind of work. So I rather dramatically gave it all up, and in my late 20s went traveling, studied Tibetan Buddhism for a long time, and spent a lot of time in the monasteries in India and Nepal and Tibet. I came back to this country and studied shamanism, and I have been practicing and training and apprenticing in classical shamanism for about 25 years. And that for me was a way of looking at the whole, kind of like the kind of a way that one of my teachers kind of described it was seeing nature as the visible face of spirit. And it was very, for me, the shamanic kind of traditions look at the subtleties that lie behind and how to kind of relate with those subtleties. Jack, you were talking about, the subtleties of things. For me, shamanic work, and when I say shamanic work, I mean kind of the cross-cultural, out of context kind of ways of trying to understand how shamanic practice was done, in the places that we can still understand it today, how it would have been in our country. There's all kinds of cultural considerations when you talk about shamanic work. But yes, and obviously, again, we all have our own feelings about that. But for me, it was an amazing kind of initiation and introduction into kind of like the subtle realms and how to work with them. The problem that I found was that a lot of that work at that time, and I'm talking 15, 20 years ago, was very much based on kind of the development of the individual or the healing of other humans. It was very human centric. And for me, I was very much more interested in the relationship between the human and the more than human, and how we could use some of these methods to connect, relate. I don't want to say heal because that's an assumption, but how we can transform our relationship with nature. And I became quite frustrated with the kind of shamanic type community and work because it felt that it wasn't going to that place. So the breakthrough for me, sorry, I'll come to an end in a minute and we can kind of talk about it together. For me, a breakthrough was arriving at a place called Schumacher College. And I don't know kind of if any of you came across Schumacher College. It's kind of, it's recently closed, but about 15, 20 years ago, I arrived at Schumacher College and I was lucky enough to work there for 10 years. And for me, it was a place where ecology and the kind of spiritual work, if that's how we want to label it, were being put together. It's a college in Devon, so southwest England, kind of positioned just under Dartmoor, the storied moor, very kind of a place that holds a lot of stories and depth. And it was set up by a Jain monk, very much Satish Kumar. I'm sure some of you will have heard of him. It was set very much on an ashram style of everybody kind of working together, and kind of head, hands, and heart was kind of the pedagogical kind of explanation of how the place was run. But the thing that really fascinated me was one of their principles that I've kind of been exploring ever since to kind of figure out what it means. And it's the whole kind of principle or content area or subject, however you want to kind of think of it, of deep ecology, which to me is that bringing together of those two sides that I'm talking about. Deep ecology. So I kind of just leave that hanging just as a kind of concept for you to think about, because I think really all of this is an inquiry for all of us. Where do these two things sit, and what does deep ecology mean for us? Where do we meet the world? It's that kind of meeting place somehow, that kind of, when I say deep ecology, I mean that place somewhere where we meet the world. And the way that Schumacher College was going about this exploration of deep ecology, and I'm looking back and I'm making all these assumptions and kind of explanations. I'm not sure I'm not sure if you asked anybody that was there at the time they would agree with this, but this is kind of my reading afterwards. The way that the college was looking at deep ecology was through something they were calling holistic science, which was and there were two kind of main teachers looking at this. A chap called Brian Goodwin and a chap called Stephen Harding, who then went on to write a book called Animate Earth, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But between the two of them, they were bringing in teachers from all around the world who were interested in expanding our understanding of science to include information that we gain through our senses, information that we gain through our intuition and our imagination. And it was kind of looking at ourselves as humans within a world that's participatory, inside a whole system where everything is connected and participating together. So one of the earliest teachers in the college, a long time before I arrived, although he was still coming in my time, was James Lovelock, who came up with the Gaia theory. So he was very influential in the work of the college. There was Arnie Ness, who was the grandfather of deep ecology, Rupert Sheldrake, with his kind of expanded sense of what science could be. All of these names have kind of been questioned by the scientific establishment, over the years, but gradually what they are talking about gradually becomes accepted. There were just a lot of James Hillman came, lots of other names that I could kind of bore you with for hours, but it felt like it was a place where the way that we understand science could be completely different. where we can put together our objective kind of scholarly critical thinking with our phenomenological subjective experience. And for me, that is a really exciting way of kind of figuring out how the world works. You know, for me, that's a spiritual kind of way of being in the world, putting those two kind of ways of knowing together. And I find that particularly exciting when you look at academia, you know, that has tended to focus on the objective scholarly, but to actually have the experiential kind of way in. So I think Schumacher College was doing something really interesting there. And of course, it was while I was there that Lampeter, University of Wales, Trinity Saint David, came along and said, you know, we'd love to do a master's program with you. What would you like to do? What's really the essence of the college? What could we possibly do with you? And pretty much immediately was ecology and spirituality as two things that really stand for what we're talking about here. How to put these two very different ways of thinking and yet the same or overlapping, or there is something that coheres them. You know, put those two things together, and suddenly you have the possibility to understand our relationship, our belonging, our meaning, our homemaking with the natural world. So I don't know if that means kind of, if that resonates with you at all. You're in this now, you're kind of the cohort that's in this, and we're only about 5 years. I can't remember, Jack, how long we've been doing this or when this all started, but it feels like you're the cohort in that now, and I'd love to kind of hear how that's landing for you. Before we go into that, maybe I could tell you just a little bit about what I'm kind of doing now and where it brought me. So, kind of in my bringing together of these two things, it's a bit of an alchemical thing, isn't it? When you have two things that you put together, quite often something springs out of it that wasn't what you were expecting. For me, my interest, after brewing on all of this for years and years, has turned to an area that I'm calling contemporary animism. And I was kind of talking about Stephen Harding as being one of the people at Schumacher College that wrote this wonderful book called Animate Earth. So if you get the opportunity, I'm sure you've got a massive reading list. But for me, Stephen Harding was an ecologist, but he was also a magician. And it never sat very, those two things never sat very well for him. And actually, he passed away last year. And the last thing he said to me was, I wish that I could have had the courage to admit that magic and science could be done to get, you know, he wished that he'd brought more of the magician into his science. And I kind of said to him, you know, but the thing is, Stefan, you have, because this deep ecology and this idea of an animate earth and the work with James Lovelock and the Gaia theory is actually the bridge that we can all cross to kind of making these two things compatible, bringing both of them into the world. So I can't remember quite where I was going with that, but if you get the chance to read Animate Earth, it's written from an ecological perspective, but you can kind of see the magic in it as well, or you can see the stepping off into where magic can be brought into this kind of ecological worldview. But it was really through him that I became very interested in animism. And Jack, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of animism. I'm sure it's something you'll be kind of covering within the program. But for me, it was Graham Harvey actually that coined the term contemporary animism. And I'll read you his definition. It is the understanding that the world is full of persons, only some of which are human, and that all life is lived in relationship with others. So it's the understanding, I think, that there is intelligence and agency everywhere, that we are not the only holders of intelligence and agency, as we've actually been kind of led to believe by a lot of our kind of, well, religions, educate, somehow over the past couple of thousand years, in particular cultures, we've kind of been led to believe that we perhaps are the only holders of that. But this recognition that everything is intelligent and that there is a conversation within the natural world. So this kind of brings me back to the mountain thing. And just to say, yeah, it brings me back to the mountain thing in that, with intelligence and agency, there is also communication. And our science, and again, I'm sure Jack will cover a lot of this, science is now starting to show that there is communication within species, there is communication between species. And my fascination is where humans fit with that. I know that a mountain was trying to communicate with me. I know that it is possible to communicate with other beings in this animate world. How does that work? It's something that I call kind of, I have a friend who is from a lineage of the Romani gypsy. He's one of the last kind of Romani gypsy Shavanos, the medicine people of the gypsy tradition, who were kind of here in Europe and in this country, and still practicing until fairly recently. And his tradition talks about the common wild tongue. And this is kind of like I've kind of really that those words have just really kind of started something for me, because it goes back to the mountain conversation, and it feels like something to do with this Hariath that I was talking about at the beginning. Is there a common wild tongue of nature that perhaps we are a part of, that we are not conscious of, that perhaps comes up in our dreams, in our intuitions, that once we may have been able to consciously understand. So that is my current inquiry. I'm working with scientists, with animal and plant communicators, with ceremonialists, Indigenous elders from this country and from all over the world, to look into how it's possible for us to get back into that conversation. And we kind of talk about nature connection. There's lots of nature connection these days is kind of something that pe people want to do. They want to kind of do nature connection work, and that's wonderful. And actually, 5 years ago, that was very niche and nobody was talking about it, but it seems quite big in the mainstream now. I would say it's not about nature connection for me. It's something deeper. It's about actually feeling ourselves within that conversation of nature, a very, very deep relationship that's participatory, it's reciprocal, it's it's animate, it's intelligent, it's something that is innate and inherent in all of us. It's not just something that was our ancestors, some romantic idea that our ancestors were maybe doing this and now we're not, because we've got science and we're educated, or indigenous people can still do it. It's something that's really, really inherent and not too far under the surface. And the minute you start kind of scratching it, the minute you start taking part in ritual and ceremony, the minute you start going out regularly to be in a place, the minute you do a vigil kind of overnight out in nature, the minute you come across a wild animal that you weren't expecting to, and you're shocked into kind of like, I think that this possibility is still within us. And that is what I am interested in uncovering. And as I continue with the work of Animate Earth, so I've set up an organization called the Animate Earth Collective, which kind of brings together writers and poets and scientists and all of those people to talk and compare notes. And any circle that I sit with, so I sit with lots of circles online and we come together residentially as well, you can almost guarantee that everybody can come up with a similar experience, of being in conversation with nature at some point in their lives. Everybody kind of knows everybody knows in their hearts what we're talking about here. And there seems to be an appetite for kind of uncovering that and restoring it, and kind of as an antidote to some of the other things that might be happening in the kind of world at the moment. And just to say one last thing, one thing I do as well is work with the farming and growing community. So I kind of curate a conference every January called the Oxford Real Farming Conference. It's a congregation of agroecologists from around the country, from all kinds of different backgrounds, very much interested in kind of how we make change in the way we grow food and we steward land. So it's a very practical audience. And we've started kind of holding sessions and conferences on listening to the land. So looking at these very subtle kind of conversations that one can have with the natural world. And we have queues out the door of farmers trying to get in, because kind of as the frontline people working with the land, they know that there's this reciprocal relationship possible because they're doing it, So I'm really heartened that, yeah, that this kind of understanding is starting to re-emerge in the world. And yeah.